Now, if you're just starting out, I want you to know that mastering the consistency of paint is a lifelong endeavor. You're not going to get it right away, and that's okay. You're just going to be aware of it and start to practice it. So I'm adding some more paint into this. And you can see as I add more pigment into this puddle of water, it starts to get a little thicker. Okay. Now, if I take some of this paint out of here and just put it here where there's no water at all, this is just the paint, it's much thicker, right? Now, the indication that I like to use here, quick little sample, is if I pull the brush through, does the paint rejoin right away? Okay. So let's take some pigment and make a really watery mix of it right here. Okay. So you see when I pull my brush through, it doesn't leave a white line at all, right? It just immediately fills back together. Now, for the sake of simplicity and understanding, I like to say this is kind of a skim milk consistency, right? It's easy for us to visualize that skim milk consistency. Then as we add more pigment to the water, like right here, it becomes more like a whole milk or a half and half, more of a creamy color. So when I pull my brush through that, do you see that white line of the palette showing through? So it's still coming back together, but it's not immediate, right? And I'm going to rinse my brush out here and dry it off, okay? And show you, right, with this one down here, this is just the pigment. I didn't have any water in this one first. So when I pull that through, see that line and how it stays for quite a while longer. This consistency here is more of a thicker, heavy cream kind of consistency, all right? And this consistency is the one we want when we're working wet into wet most of the time. Now, as far as how these spread in water, that's why consistency is so important. So let me show you something really quick here. I'm going to take some water on this paper, and you're welcome to do these tests along with me because it's going to help you understand it better. So I'm going to put a little circle of water here, okay? And I'm going to do that 3 times. And they're all the same level of wetness and the same level of glistening. So I have 3 little circles you can see right there in the light reflecting. If I take this one that's the thinnest paint and pop it in, okay, we'll see how that spreads. Take this one that's a bit thicker and drop it in, okay? And then we'll take this one that's the thickest of them and drop that in. Okay, tell me in the chat what you notice about those 3 different examples. And you can even say why you think that's important. Because yes, remember there's 2 buckets. When we have more water in a paint, it gets more diluted, but this is separate. We're just talking about consistency right now. We're not talking about how light or dark the color is. So as Kim says, the thicker it is, the less it spreads. Why would that be important? Okay. Sandy says the thin spreads more, the thicker spreads less. Lisa says more control with thicker paint. Yep. Okay, so the thin paint will bleed a lot. Yep. Thicker, okay, Linda said this is a great way to say it. The thicker paint can be directed or blended where you want. Cynthia says the thicker is easier to control. Exactly. Now, you wouldn't want super thick paint if you're going right to your dry paper, okay? Because if I take this thick paint right here and I want to paint on dry paper with it, I can't get very far before I run out of paint and it doesn't really spread. All those little white dots are the paper coming through. Let me rinse my brush off, okay? If I take this medium kind of thickness, this whole milk, half and half-ish, right, somewhere in that spectrum, and paint with it, I get further, but still not that far, right, because we can see the paper coming through. So if I take my thinnest paint with the more water in it and pull that across, I can get a lot further, right? And I still have paint on my brush if I do it again. So when we go with painting with our paint onto dry paper, we want our paint to be thinner. When we're going onto wet paper, we want our paint to be a little thicker. Now I've just showed you 3, but of course there's a whole range. It's a spectrum. We can go as thin as water and we can go as thick as squeezing it out of the tube and painting with that, which is the thickest our paint can get. So when we talk about consistency as we're painting this, you're going to keep going back and forth between these different things. And it's going to take some practice. So I would prefer it if you looked at your first painting of this as practice, because it takes that time. It takes the repetition of doing it on 20 different petals to really understand how the consistency and water control affects things. Well, the other thing that we have to think about is how much water is on our paper. So let me draw a couple little petal shapes here for us. Okay, so there's a couple petals. And I'm going to put too much water on this first one. Okay, so I'm going to fill this petal in with my brush. And I'm not going to like make it comically too much water, like dump a bucket of water on here, but just too much, okay? Like a little bit too much. Probably should have let that sink in a little more. Okay, if you look at it in the light, it's just a little bit too much. It's starting to run a little bit, okay? So if I take even my medium consistency paint here and drop it in, it's going to be floating on top of the water, okay? It's going to move a lot more, even though that's a paint that we should have more control over, okay? And then if I go over to this petal and I glaze it with water, with the right amount of water, which means that the whole surface is glistening, okay? That it's all covered with water and that there aren't any drips forming and it's not like a bubble that's forming on top of it, okay? Now, if you're in a very dry climate, you might have to put that water down and then add some more if it dries too fast, okay? You can see the consistency of that has a glisten, but there's not too much. When I take this paint now, it's going to spread, but it's a much more controlled spread. So we have a few different things that we're considering here, right? We have the consistency of our paint, okay? Paint consistency. And we have the amount of water. Those are both really important things. The last kind of variable that I want to talk about is how wet your brush is. Now, this one is important because it's not one that gets talked about very much, and it is almost second nature after you've been painting for a while. So, it's easy to forget to talk about it. If I want to blend this together, my brush right now is mostly dry. It's a little bit damp, and so I can come in here and push that paint around and blend it really nicely. If I dry my brush off too much, okay, so now my brush is too dry and I go in to do this, it's going to suck up the paint and water so that we get a hard edge between our blend, okay? It's not going to be soft anymore. By contrast, if I come in here and my brush is too wet, so now my brush is way too wet, I'm not dabbing it off here, I'm not scraping it on the rim of the cup. Oh, I just did it automatically. This is what you should always do. Dip your brush in, scrape it on the rim of the cup. So it's automatic for me. So too much water on my brush. If I come in here to try and blend, you're going to get back bleeds. The water is going to start to move the pigment. So you're not going to get a nice smooth blend. You're going to get the pigment being shoved out of the way. We don't want that, okay?